Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Allen After Hours. First, I would like to thank Jill Greenwood, Alyssa Traister, Andre Septevic, Michael Reynolds, and Jessica Lear for all of their tireless efforts in making events like Allen After Hours come to life each month. Special thanks to Christina Nielsen and her students for inviting Dr. Theresa Kutasz Christensen to speak with them about the importance of provenance research today. And finally, I would like to thank my student assistant, Natalia Alvarado, for all of her hard work today and every single day. Yesterday, Wednesday, April 9th, was International Provenance Research Day. So it seems fitting to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Theresa Kutasz Christensen, who is a leading figure in this field. Dr. Christensen is an art historian specializing in women's roles in the historical art market and provenance research. She completed her master's and doctorate in art history at the Pennsylvania State University, focusing on the antiquities collection of Queen Christina of Sweden. She is an advocate for accessible modes of collections documentation that break down real and perceived barriers between museums and their publics, and has held numerous collection and research positions at institutions including the Smithsonian American Art Museum, National Museum of Asian Art, Archives of American Art, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. Most recently, she served on the curatorial team for the award-winning catalog and exhibition, Making Her Mark, A History of Women Artists in Europe 1400 to 1800, which was produced for the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Art Gallery of Ontario. She has published extensively on early modern art history, and her work has been generously supported by awards and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Swedish American Fulbright Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and Oxford University, among others. Today, Theresa's presentation will examine issues and challenges related to the collection, location, and display of pre-modern women's work in museums through the lens of pieces in the Allen's collection. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Theresa Kutasz Christensen.
That was an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be with you all here this evening. A thank you to Dr. Brown for inviting me, and to the entire staff here at the Allen Memorial Art Museum. Everyone in Oberlin has been so incredibly welcoming. I've had a sort of a whirlwind tour of the Frank Lloyd Wright House and the collections and everything today. It's been a real pleasure to be here. So I will start off by kind of giving you a little bit of context for where the content of this talk tonight is coming from, sort of from my perspective. So my talk today is placed within the context of two long-term projects that I have been working on. The first is my role as a provenance researcher, where I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make collections more searchable and the objects in them more researchable. The second is this a kind of a complementary focus, which is my collaboration with Dr. Andali Banta, whose work here at the Allen is former curator of this collection, some of you might be familiar with, and Dr. Alexa Greist on the curatorial team for the exhibition that Marlies just mentioned, Making Her Mark. The exhibition was at the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Art Gallery of Ontario, where it closed in July of last year. Between its two venues, it was viewed by more than 100,000 people over 5 months. The show explored the multifaceted and often overlooked ways that women contributed to the visual arts in Europe. Our focus was on displaying exclusively objects made by women or objects in which we could reasonably assert a woman's hand or their contribution to the making process. Today, I want to talk about some of the issues and the challenges that these projects have illuminated for me as a researcher, in locating women artists in museum, library, and historical collections, as well as the location and equitable presentation of women's work. Instead of just coming and walking you through the Making Her Mark show, if you want to see that, we produced a nice catalog that went with it. Today, I'm going to look at examples here in your collections at the Allen Memorial Art Museum and examine how they are illustrative of the diverse challenges that we face in studying early modern women as examples of our ability to continue the work of locating women's histories so that these histories don't remain hidden. I'm going to start with a little bit about Making Her Mark, though, because it kind of highlights our approach to this material, which has very much shaped my own approach to researching and exhibiting women artists. The Making Her Mark show opened at the BMA in October of 2023 and included over 250 works, with examples by artistic heroines such as Sofonisba Anguissola, Artemisia Gentileschi, Luisa Roldan, Rachel Reusch, Rosalba Carriera, Judith Leister, and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. In recent years, these artists have rightfully been celebrated, both in monographic shows, and I hope that everyone here is going to run to Toledo, where the Rachel Reusch is opening. They're having the reception as we speak. So this weekend that will open, and it's going to be spectacular. So they have received this kind of recognition in monographic exhibitions and in fantastic new book series like the Illuminating Women Artists series from the Getty and Amsterdam University Press. The Making Her Mark show was developed thematically, with these celebrated painters placed in conversation with exemplary products of female artisanal collectives and talented amateurs. These women operated outside of male-dominated professional arenas and often remained anonymous in the historical record. Examples of ceramics and textile design with metalwork, bookmaking, tapestry, manuscript illumination, and cabinet making were presented to illustrate women's involvement in major centers of production. Our criteria for women's involvement was necessarily quite broad, as it stemmed from a desire to decenter the notion that worthy art was produced by a solitary male genius wielding a paintbrush or a chisel. These so-called major arts of painting and sculpture were championed by systems of education and professionalization that were largely developed by men and for men. Our view of early modern artistic production located women as artists, as makers, as managers, and as material suppliers, as well as anonymous or anonymized laborers in workshops and manufacturers. In building Making Her Mark, our curatorial team made the conscious decision to consider works beyond the individual and the identifiable, both in-depth investigations into the BMA's own collection, as well as decades of feminist scholarship, made it clear that if the goal is to locate more women in museums and to continue to build collections representative of their contributions, and actually I'm one for it, to build collections representative of their contributions, it is essential that we continue to locate professional women artists and their historical presence in archives and seek reattributions where possible. Additionally, though, we found it important to embrace the exhibition of these unknown makers, recognizing women's historic roles in sites of collaborative making, as well as anonymous, silent, or forced labor, where we may never recover their individual identities, but where the works can serve as a testament to the histories. We asked the question, why are we only interested in historical women when they can be proven to be an exception to their gender, and not instead look at these so-called exceptions within the context of the many women who led fantastic, meaningful, and productive artistic careers, working within and as part of their period's patriarchal standards? This is what Andalib asks in the opening essay of our catalog, In Search of the Unexceptional Woman Artist. In the wake of the Me Too movement, many museums were pushed to develop, at least internally, statistics on how many women artists were represented in their collections. Many followed these assessments with vows to diversify their holdings, and this was accomplished through the acquisition of art by women on a broad scale. This laudable effort followed close on the heels of a publication of a 2019 study by a group of scholars out of Williams College, which identified only a 13% average representation in major American collections for works by women. That study was conducted by scraping the online metadata of 18 major museums, and demographic information was developed, which included the crowdsourced identification for the gender of each individually identified artist that they documented. It may come as no surprise that the best performing institutions in this study when it comes to representing women were those with a contemporary focus, namely the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, which had 22, 18, and 25% of their collections respectively made by named women. At first blush, the apparent lack of objects in museums representing pre-modern women would kind of contradict them, this study indicated, would contradict what we were trying to argue with making her mark. Specifically, it would maybe argue against our aim to dispel the myth that women artists in pre-modern Europe were rare or that they were comparatively untalented. Indeed, convincing institutions with only a handful of pre-1800 works by women painters on their walls to give up those works to us for the better part of a year was a challenge, albeit one that 70 generous lenders, including the Allen Memorial Art Museum, ultimately rose to meet. This apparent lack of work by women might be better understood if we look at the primary parameter of the 2019 study, one of which was, and I quote, "Starting with the data obtained from crowd workers, we first eliminated records that did not correspond to individual and identifiable artists," end quote. This issue of identifiable artists is one that I'm going to address kind of throughout this talk. But first, I want to turn briefly to this issue of the need to crowdsource all of those gendered tags. So why don't most museums include things like demographic search terms for the artist in their online collection search platforms? Why can't you just go online and find out what percentage of a museum's works are by women? For institutions which are claiming to prioritize work and gender inequity, why would they not all have adopted something like a quick and easy way to locate women in their collection? And this can be particularly puzzling if an institution is publishing data on their collection demographics, appearing to have already done this work of locating and counting works by women in its collections. Some institutions like the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. have gotten around the issue of tagging the entirety of their holdings by making object packages of works by women, which appear on their websites as themes. These theme views have the advantage of leaning on curatorial knowledge to deepen an online experience without the downside of ghettoizing these works together by women in a single gallery. The downside is that these theme views still come without full collection searchability. My answer to the question of why more collections are not fully gender tagged is kind of frustratingly simple, and it boils down to issues of both funding and the fact that most museum database systems do not have a field where you can identify that for individual artists. If such a field was created, I think the ability of the institution to populate it across all collecting areas would make its utility uneven at best. Much of the challenge comes down to these issues of staff time and resources, But there's also the issue of the efficacy of such tools and how tags would be researched and implemented. Contemporary artists will often provide a preferred gender, but for historical artists, one runs into sort of ethical and practical issues surrounding the assignment of tags, which might be anachronistic or unintentionally in opposition to their identity or their conception of self. There's also the very real worry that ambiguity or lack of any historical evidence to guide such tagging may lead to not tagging portions of the collection and thereby inflicting further erasure and unsearchability, as well as unresearchability, on these marginalized artists of the past. Despite these challenges, some moves have been made to try documenting artists' gender in museum databases, and this has largely been through third-party software, like the Mujeres en las Artes Visuales. This was a service announced with much fanfare in 2019, but it failed to find its footing and it no longer appears to exist. Such projects could really help in showing both strengths and failings in the diversity of museum holdings and could help guide collecting. But it's worth noting that even providing better searchability in one area does not necessarily increase the overall research ability of marginalized groups. Such searches will return only that which is securely documented, and as we know, much of women's history lacks the kind of secure documentation on which databases are constructed. As we will see in the examples that I'm about to show, this means that we need to rely on something in addition to searches for named makers in order to locate works by women in a collection. Since Linda Nauchlin's 1971 positing of the question, why have there been no great women artists? Scholars have worked tirelessly to develop accurate tombstone information, that's name, dates of birth and death, etc., for these women artists to reconstruct their oeuvres. Much of this work is dependent on our continued work in understanding the contexts in which most women worked and the structures of their society, which have allowed their contributions to go under-acknowledged or undocumented. I will now turn to some select works in the Allen's impressive collection of work by early modern women to look at some of these contexts of making and challenges in identifying individuals. Beginning with perhaps the most common or straightforward method of locating artists in a collection, we might start by conducting a simple search of the names field. But how do you choose these names, and on what authority should we base this selection? There are, of course, women out there who've never been lost. That they have always been part of the embraced canon of art history. And this is largely because of their inclusion in or their adaptation to male-dominated, biographically focused models of art history, that were established in 1550 by Giorgio Vasari, when he set the stage for the following 4 centuries of art historical inquiry with the publication of his Vitae, or his Lives of the Artists. While Vasari's work has long been understood to include fabrications and exaggerations in the form of historical biographical tropes, the artists included in it have long framed our understanding of Western art historical traditions. Only one woman, the sculptor Properzia de Rossi, was included in the first edition of the Vitae, while the second edition, produced 18 years later, included 3 more women, along with the mention of several others. This included the engraver Diana Sculturi. She was also called Diana Mantuana, and she was the only one of this woman that Vasari knew himself personally. Sculturi was trained in a family of engravers from Mantua, hence her often used moniker, La Mantuana. She would have likely been trained in her family workshop under her father, who used the surname Sculturi as a nod to his occupation. She would have learned initially by working off of popular prints, Renaissance and antique sculptures, as we can see here in her engraving on the right, which is based off of her study of an engraving in the center by Cornelius Cort, which in turn was based off of the famous Roman sculpture of the Spinario. Scultori enjoyed a lauded career in Rome, and she contributed to major print series, becoming the first woman printmaker to receive a papal privilege to print her own works and to market them. Such recognition of her skill, along with her documentation in seminal art historical texts like Vasari's Vitae, have kept her, so to speak, on the art historical radar. But equally significant in our ability to identify her work is the presence of her signature. Scultori is the first female engraver in Europe that we know of to have signed her works. Here's another print by Scultori in the Allens collection, and we're looking at it on the museum's website. And here you can see another name, that Gysi appears in parentheses. This is the result of an error that was made in an old master print catalog in the 19th century. And it has long complicated the artist's searchability in scholarship and now in museum databases. In this case, while it does not appear in the name field, the Allen has done a really great job with searchability, where a collection search of Mantuana on the website will bring up all three of the works they own by Scultori. This is certainly not always the case. The artist's name appears 3 times on this print in the Allen's collection, which was made 1 year after her death. There's her signature in the lower left of Diana F., which stands for fecit or made this. There's a dedication by the individual responsible for the posthumous print. That's at center. It identifies her as Diana Scultori Mantovana, Diana the sculptor or the engraver from Mantua. And Scultori's dedication of the work to the Duchess of Mantua on the lower right, where she identifies herself as Diana Mantuana. Now, all artists, particularly from this period, have multiple names that they were known by or have alternate spellings. This is not unique to women artists. This is one of the reasons for the existence of the Getty's Union list of artist names. And here we can see that the Getty Names Index entry with all of these different names that she has been published under or which she used. Still, I would like to note that because a lot of research on women's biographies is very recent, we have kind of always, for at least a century maybe, had biographical information on a lot of male artists. But research on women artists has largely gained traction since the 1970s, 1990s. And so the Getty Union list of artist names is not always up to date with the very current research being done to locate women's biographical information. But still, this has its uses. On the right, for comparison, I have a list of all of the names that Scultori herself had used on her prints as her signatures throughout her career. As you look down this list, you can see shifts throughout her life in how she identifies herself. We see her as Diana Filia, Diana the daughter. We see her identifying with her native city as Diana Mantovana. We also see her identifying with her life in Rome, staking a claim to that location as her place of vocation. One of the major issues that we need to address in researching and writing about women is the nature and impact of these shifting aspects of identity throughout their lives and careers. The work of tracking women artists is often complicated by name changes due to marriage, as well as long periods of inactivity due to marriage or child rearing. Like today, the impact of these life changes on women artists could be quite varied. We know some women, like the Dutch engraver Magdalena van de Passe, stopped their professional production almost completely after marriage. For many women, this led to shortened careers and therefore smaller oeuvres, and a greater difficulty in applying traditional connoisseurial skills to identify their work and reattribute works to their hands. Other women worked throughout their marriages. As we see here, Scultori actually was a collaborator with her architect husband, hence his name appearing in conjunction with hers in some of her signatures. We know that Scultori had at least one child, While other women artists seem to have remained active with many, Artemisia Gentileschi birthed 5 children that we know of, while Lavinia Fontana birthed 11. The dangers of childbirth, though, must also be considered when we are looking at the small oeuvres of many early modern women. The careers of artists such as Maria Clara Eimart were cut short during childbirth. Here we have one of the popular devotional engravings made by the Bolognese artist Elisabetta Serrani, now in the Allens collection. When Serrani was young, she was very prolific. She was head of her father's workshop and the primary breadwinner for her family by the time she was in her early 20s. But Serrani's early death at just 27 years old highlights this issue of the shortened lives of many historical women. I will add a caveat here that while Serrani's early death may have been attributed by her biographer Malvasia to heartbreak over being too old to marry, it was probably a much more medically valid condition that led to her early passing. Yeah, well, I'll take that, leave that sink in for just a second. Working outside of many apprentice systems and academic training structures, many women like Scultori worked with or were trained by their relatives. They often married within specialist networks to continue working as vital members of family workshops. And for specialties like cabinetry, sculpture, publishing, or printmaking, it was male family members whose names were attached both to the guild records and consequently to the works produced in these studios. We know about women's contributions in these contexts where their identities are often hidden behind male family members' names, primarily from signed work, or when as widows, the women took over management and ownership of their workshops. And that's a topic which I will touch on a little bit more in a minute. In some locations, we know a lot more than in others about the roles assigned to women within family workshops or apprentice systems. In 17th century Spain, we know relatively little about the ability of women to specialize within a workshop, making it a lot harder to know where to look for their contributions. Here we have a work by the Spanish etcher, Luisa Rafaela Valdés y Morales. The print is signed, but we know relatively little about her training and her employment, outside of the fact that she seems to have been put to work in her family workshop, and she worked on a range of projects documented for that workshop. This includes sculptural gilding as well as etching. She made a set of 3 of these plates for a volume on which her father and her brother Lucas also worked. While this dearth of information may be in part due to a greater scarcity of records and extant works the further back in time we go, even 100 years later in France, we run into the issue of women artists' work being obscured by the fame and the names of their male family members. In this print by the engraver Anne Allen, recently acquired for the Allen Memorial Art Museum, we can see a signature at the lower left. This is not Allen's signature. Rather, it's the name of her husband, the designer Jean Pilament. The two worked closely together, producing several notebooks of designs, which could be used by a range of other artisans to add chinoiserie-style designs to their works. And here I have an example from the Gardner Museum of one of these sorts of works that would have utilized Allen's designs. This plate was made by the renowned ceramic workshop run by the Veuve Perrin, or the widow Perrin. Anne Allen was adept in printing in the style that we call à la poupée, a method where a rag is used to separately ink different sections of the printing plate to produce a multicolored print. This is a laborious process which takes skill to master. Although we know very little about Allen's biography, we do know that she was Pilament's second wife, and that they met while the two were living in southern France, not marrying until Allen was in her late 40s. based on what we know of other women's training and careers, it is reasonable to assume that Allen was already an experienced engraver when she met Pilament. It also seems that she was an artistic collaborator with him before she was his wife, although just about everything we know about her is through her relationship with his published designs. To illustrate this, in Wikipedia, Pilament has a pretty robust page that has a single mention of Allen. Allen herself is linked, but has no page of her own. And since Wikipedia is the sort of starting place where many students and others go to find a summary of an artist's biography, their work, their artistic context, or published reference biographies for further reading, this is an obvious detriment to the promotion of effective research on her. And I will say that this bothered me so much that I am now halfway through writing a Wikipedia page on Anne Allen, so check back. So while we have these small ideas of the shape of Luisa Morales or Anne Allen's working lives, there are many women with whom we run into the issue of having no biography at all. This issue is exemplified by the spectacular crucifix in the Allen Memorial Art Museum's collection, which they generously lent to the Making Her Mark show. It was painted by María Josefa Sánchez, who was active in Spain in the mid-17th century. And there are several variants of her, by her, known, some of which are signed and some of which are attributed solely based on their format, their materials, and their stylistic similarities to signed copies like this. I recently gave a short presentation on another very similar crucifix by this artist, going over some of these very same points that I've talked about tonight, about the anonymity of historical women. And the very first question that I received when I finished was, can you tell us some more about her biography? And I say this not to call out that question as uninformed, but rather to highlight the extent to which we have been conditioned to reject the idea that there is simply no biographical information available. In some cases, a name would help, but in this case, we simply haven't found additional information about her. And it's what we look for to help relate more personally to objects of the past. I don't fault people for searching for biographical information. But in a museum context, this lack of biographical data runs the risk of placing works like these outside of many established museological conventions, where curators and educators look to these elements of personal biography to connect works of the past with modern visitors. It can make these works more difficult to slot into traditional thematic gallery narratives, which rely on connections like artist schools or training, or their public accolades and their academic accomplishments. As these examples highlight, searching women by name can be difficult, and in many cases it is impossible, and we do not have records for the names of many women artists, particularly when we look outside of those major arts of painting and sculpture. In our work for Making Her Mark, this challenge was met by deep diving many dozens of collections by media. In assessing women's roles in the process of making, it became clear that not only did women work in every single media that we investigated, but that many of the media in which they were most prolific, such as waxwork, shell work, hair work, cut and rolled paper, pastel, watercolor, lacquer, découpé, lace making, embroidery, fan making, japanning, and weaving, are incredibly fragile and or light sensitive. This means that along with their second-tier designation as craft, it has left them off museum walls. And I will point out this is not necessarily due to curatorial choice, but due to light restrictions that only allow these objects to be seen for a few months every decade. As a sort of research 1-2 punch, This lack of visibility and lack of public and scholarly knowledge also trickles down to leave them at a low priority for documentation and for digitization. This further obscures their presence in database searches. When I have found myself working to locate works in these fragile and diverse materials, it is often not major museums, but rather small regional collections and academic collections, like the one you have here at the Allen, or the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the Mutter Museum's collection of historic hair work, or the Sampler collection at Vassar's Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center, which have long-standing traditions of caring for and stewarding works by women. As a related aside, I would like to note here that these are all vital regional repositories at which women museum directors have historically found the most professional success. When I started exploring the Allen's collections by media, I began with a search for needlework samplers. This is both a medium where we know that women produced a majority of the examples, removing some of the uncertainty around attributing anonymous work to women. And it's a medium where we have some of the earliest examples where we know a woman's name, since it wasn't uncommon by the mid-18th century for them to stitch their name, their age, their school, or the name of their town into their works. I will point out, though, that that name or that age is often all we know about these historic makers. In addition to works like these made within so-called amateur contexts, although many of the women that made those works may well have utilized skills professionally in workshops or in cottage industry, we know that many women were prolific makers and held successful careers as heads of professional workshops. Like embroidery, metalwork is a really rich medium to look for women makers in, since silversmiths were required to place their mark on works, not as signatures, like we were looking at with the engravers, but to certify the quality of the silver. And those marks were registered, meaning that we can find them in the places where we normally find male producers. We can trace their locations, their names, and their years of production, particularly in places like France and England. We have archival documentation for these makers. Here we have 2 spoons from the Allen's collection, and these bear the silver mark of Hester Bateman, the noted matriarch of the Bateman Silver Workshop. As a widow, Hester Bateman ran the workshop for nearly 30 years, and she trained her sons to take over the business. And she also apprenticed female family members, such as her daughter-in-law, Anne Bateman. In some media, we do not have any names at all, but our knowledge of early modern working practices indicates women's hands. The lace collar, which looks sort of like a Point de Venise lace, seen on the Ethiopian traveler Zaga Christ in the miniature on the right, is painstakingly rendered by the Italian court painter Giovanna Carconi. And this lace represents the fine lace work produced by generations of now anonymous European women in workshops, convents, and as forced labor. While many media like lace became synonymous with women makers, many women became synonymous with their media. These practitioners often innovated in their fields, both by necessity and through the need to engage their entrepreneurial spirits to navigate social restrictions placed on them. The Italian portraitist Rosalba Carriera, whose work we see on the left, became a household name across much of 18th century Europe. Although, as Angela Oberer has pointed out in her recent book on the artist, Carriera's fame today has been a hard-won battle to revitalize even a fraction of the renown that she had in her own day. In many respects, this is due to the materials in which she worked. Pastel is an incredibly fragile and light-sensitive material, making survival for the works in pastel that she made precarious, and the display and travel for major exhibitions a huge logistical challenge. Before Carriera became known for her pastel visages of grand tourists, though, she was known for her innovations in painting in miniature and became the first artist to produce works on ivory and tortoise shell for the use as snuff box lids or as small mementos. Traditionally, miniatures were drawn with watercolors on vellum, which is a type of prepared animal skin. And we can see that as an example in Garzoni's work. She was about a generation before Carriera, also working in Italy. The Carriera at the Allen, however, really highlights the artist's innovations in this media of tempera on ivory. The tempera gives the work a sort of luminous glow. It enhances the sitter's fashionability, and the ivory offers a much richer and a more durable product for the purchaser. As modern museum objects, though, both of these miniatures have material-based challenges. These also affect the object's visibility to visitors like us. Watercolors are incredibly susceptible to light damage, and therefore there are restrictions on how often and how long the Garzoni can be on view. For the Carriera, international controls on the movement of ivory, which totally justified, not complaining about that, make it difficult for the work to travel for exhibition, and it's nearly impossible for works like this to travel internationally for major shows on the artist. The testing needed to get around environmental and endangered species protections destroys a part of the object. And for most museums, rightfully, that is a non-starter, and these objects then remain hidden or at least trapped within their domestic institutions. In some cases, the fragility of media in which women worked have left us with nothing but written descriptions or copies of their output. Paper cutting was an elevated pastime for many, many women, some of whom, like Elizabeth Upton, the Baroness Lady Templetown, gained professional employment from their skills. We don't have any of Lady Templetown's paper cuts that I know of, but as a dilettante designer for the Wedgwood manufacturer, her cuts are now ubiquitous and in collections all over the world. We can identify many of her works through a book of engravings shown here on the right. That's now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And this was made after her original paper cuts, with her works being popular for continued production in jasperware by Wedgwood for centuries. Here on the left, we have a 19th century vase in the Allen's collection. This bears Templetown's design, but we can see here that this is just attributed to Wedgwood, which is incredibly common for these objects to only list the manufacturer. But if we look here at this belt clasp in the Walters collection, we can see that they have also tagged Lady Templetown as the designer. This little Wallace brooch attributes the design to her and makes her searchable in their collection. So it's particularly for the Making Her Mark show, I did quite a bit of work looking for Wedgwood examples, and you can't search by the designer. You have to go back and forth, which designs are by which woman, and then you have to visually search the catalogs for all of these works to find works by them. The inconsistency with which designers for Wedgwood, like Lady Templetown or Lady Diana Beauclerk, to name another, are credited for their work demonstrates just how easy it is to lose the names of individual makers behind the name of a manufacturer, or to see the total anonymization of women's labor. The candlesticks that I have here on the right were manufactured at the turn of the 19th century and identified by Brittany Luberda, the Baltimore Museum's curator of decorative arts, as exemplifying the specialization of women in the production of ceramic flowers at the Chelsea Derby manufacturer in England. For comparison, I have here on the left a pair of candlesticks in the Allen's collection. And while these works currently lack a secure attribution to a specific manufacturer, I think you can see some of the similarities in their construction and we might consider their status as emblematic, if not directly representative, of women's work. There are a wide variety of these types of sites of collaborative labor where we know that women were involved. This includes religious communities like the San Ripoli Press in Florence, where nuns produced the earliest known books typeset by women, or the Brigittine nuns of Sweden, who ran successful embroidery workshops making ecclesiastical vestments and altar frontals. The 16th century embroidery from the Allens collection that I show here is clearly the work of a skilled professionalized workshop. Whether that workshop was in a conventual context or a lay workshop isn't known, although we can say with certainty that the materials used, such as spun silk thread and metallic wrapped threads, were often processed using female labor. I think this work provides a really great point for me to make a quick note on connoisseurship. In creating Making Her Mark, one of the most persistent challenges we faced in the attribution of works to unnamed or anonymous women was the broadly held and voiced assumption that an object's quality equates directly to the professional status of the maker. Our curatorial team was on several occasions sort of put off or slightly rebuffed but in interest in a work by an unnamed artist with phrasing like, "Oh no, that one won't work, it's likely professional." With pre-modern women, that professionalized status seems to come with the assertion that in this period, professional does not equal woman-made. This assumption comes back to my point about collective labor and workshops hiding women's contributions, as well as the idea that putting the onus on the researcher to prove a woman existed in a given context, well, the default assumption is to credit men. To be clear, I am not personally arguing here for a reattribution of this to nuns, but rather I'm speaking about it for us to consider our willingness to think about where objects like it might fall within the scope of early modern materials processing and workshop practices. With the Making Her Mark show, we only included work up to about 1800, since the artistic landscape in Europe changed quite extensively with industrialization and the social movements in the 19th century. Although these challenges that I have spoken about by no means just disappear overnight. I would like to kind of close out our discussion today with a few very brief notes on women who ushered in some of these shifts, building professional networks, and exhibiting the type of large-scale history paintings that were prized by the Academy. These women trained one another to strengthen their numbers in the salons, and they built acceptance for their status as professionals. The Swiss painter Angelica Kauffmann enjoyed professional success across Europe, with particularly impactful stays in Rome and London. In 1768, Kauffmann was admitted alongside Mary Moser as one of the 2 female founding members of the British Royal Academy of Arts. Although, to highlight the continued ostracizing of women in these contexts, those 2 were invited, not technically elected, and it would not be until 1921 that a woman would be an elected member of the Academy. Kauffmann's professional success was in many ways tied to this academic accomplishment, which allowed her the ability to work within male networks of power and influence. I have here an example of her portrait of the influential German art historian Joachim Winckelmann. His writing championed the neoclassical themes that are synonymous with large-scale history paintings and the classically draped sitters that elevated Kauffmann's fame. Simultaneously, in France, there was a circle of learned women and artists that grew up around royal favorites of Marie Antoinette, like the artist Elisabeth Vigée Lebrun. Lebrun was inducted in 1883 into France's Royal Academy. Included in this group was Marie-Elisabeth Lemoine and her older sister, Marie Victorie. The two are seen here in the painting on the left that is now at the Met in New York. And that work is a self-portrait by the elder Lemoine, where she is seen teaching her younger sister to copy a large-scale history painting, which is in progress. The Lemoine sisters were active at a pivotal time in revolutionary France, when the business of painting revolved around the exhibition of works at a salon. The landscape of professional painting was significantly altered for women between the elder Lemoine's production of the work on the left and her younger sister's production of her own self-portrait shown on the right and owned here at the Allen, made just a few years later. In 1790, women were granted access to exhibit at the Salon. This marked a shift and a new era in the documentation of women's work within traditional art historical bounds that previously largely applied to men. That is, those of exhibitions, medals, and academies. This also results in a shift for us in the research landscape of how we locate, assess, and contextualize the work of women artists in Europe. Researching women's work takes a somewhat specialized skill set to navigate challenges, and as I've found, it also requires a perspectival shift, where the researcher must enter collections not with a view that every work in them is by a male artist until it is proven female, but rather with the question, what circumstance or expertise led to the creation of this work? It is only through this approach centered on locating and documenting women's roles in diverse material histories and making contexts that we might avoid the all too common pitfall of feeling secure in only attributing lesser quality unattributed works to women. Tens of thousands of visitors saw the Making Her Mark show in Baltimore and Toronto. My fellow curatorial team members, along with our amazing educators and security colleagues, were in the galleries every single day. And we never heard someone assert that they could tell by the quality of the works on display that they were women-made. Instead, it was a near continuous refrain of revelation, of I didn't know what women created. I didn't know that women ran a papal tapestry manufacturer. I didn't know women worked in scientific illustration. I didn't know that women could draw the nude male body. And I didn't know that there were so many works by women. So one of our major takeaways borne out by the research in the exhibition, and I hope illuminated here in our discussion of the Allen's collections, is that museums have more work by women than statistics based on counting named makers might show. Uncovering these histories means looking beyond labels or the current limitations of museum databases to find objects that exemplify the myriad ways in which historical women made their marks. Thank you.